Please welcome Jay Richards, Vice President of Social and Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, it's great to see all of you here. I guess this is an interesting topic, or maybe there's a bunch of people in town because of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast this morning. But whichever category you're in, we are delighted to have you here, whether you're here in person or the few hundred people watching online. I'm really excited about this conversation. In fact, sometimes when you work at a think tank, you do a lot of stuff, but probably one of the greatest things about being at a think tank is sometimes being able to host conversations you're genuinely interested in, and that is exactly what this is. We celebrated St. Patrick's Day a few days ago. It's not a federal holiday yet, at least, all right? Columbus Day is a federal holiday, and yes, and still, actually, there's some Knights of Columbus here. But in some ways, those two events, I mean, people might not realize they weren't having St. Patrick's Day in 1776. Something happened. Waves of immigrants, largely Catholic immigrants from Germany and then from Ireland, obviously, and Italy. And in some ways, the national celebration of these holidays is a way in which the American Republic accommodated and finally welcomed Catholic immigrants. So much so that we don't tend to even think of Irish and German American and even Italian Americans that have been here for several generations as different ethnic groups, right? That is sort of America at its finest. We want to talk this morning and early afternoon about the particular role of the Catholic faith in the founding and the ideas of the founding, and reflections and debates among Catholics about the meaning and the goodness or badness or mixed nature of the founding. So that's what we want to do, and there's not a better time to do it than here in 2026 as we celebrate our nation's 250th birth. So I'm delighted to introduce first the person I'm going to actually interview, which is sort of strange. I'm now realizing that I'm interviewing Michael Knowles, and probably most of you that are watching or in this room already know who Michael is, but let me give him a sort of official introduction anyway. Michael John Knowles is an American conservative political commentator, author, and media host affiliated with something called the Daily Wire since 2016. He also hosts the book club at Prager University. He's a graduate of Yale University with a degree in history and Italian literature, who initially pursued acting and is now an amazing podcaster. So you take of that sort of what you will, but it's a kind of amazing sort of transformation of his background. He began as a cultural correspondent for The Andrew Klavan Show before launching his flagship daily podcast, The Michael Knowles Show, in 2017. He previously co-hosted Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Michael's a devout Catholic who reconverted during college at Yale University. It's an amazing story. I might have to ask him about that. He married Elisa Mahler in 2018, and together, he and Elisa are father and mother of 3 sons. Please welcome Michael Knowles.
Thank you, sir.
This is fun that I'm getting to interview you, actually.
It's very uncommon.
I know, yeah, it's crazy.
I dressed for the occasion. I very rarely wear my glasses in public because my colleague Ben Shapiro says they make me look like Rachel Maddow. But I thought, if we're going to be at the August Heritage Foundation, a think tank, this could make me look smarter, so I'm going to keep them on.
That makes sense. She wouldn't wear that suit, I don't think.
That's probably true.
Well, you know, honestly, we're here to talk about the founding and Catholics and Catholicism. You had an amazing speech, actually, just earlier this morning at the Catholic Prayer Breakfast. Our friend Brad Berzer from Hillsdale gave, a professor lecture, but at the Catholic Prayer Breakfast that was also amazing. And it was probably, I've been to many of these prayer breakfasts, probably the most inspiring and encouraging that I've been to, which is, I think, nice for conservatives especially, and conservative Catholics who are, I think, having a tendency to black pill themselves or ourselves.
We always do. We always do.
Yeah, and so that's the sort of reality. So I'd love to just hear a little bit about your reversion or reconversion at Yale, and maybe some of the intellectual influences. I mean, how'd that happen?
Yeah, uncommon, I guess. Though a liberal university can either radicalize you one way or another. So you'll either be marching with Antifa or you'll return to the Catholic Church. And so for me, it was the latter. I fell away from the faith at my confirmation. The new atheists were in vogue at that time, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, all of them. And I was a 13-year-old kid who thought he was smarter than he was. And much of new atheism was to appeal to 13-year-old boys who thought they were smarter than they were. So I fell away from the faith, and I get to Yale, and most people were atheists. Many were much smarter than me. But I noticed the smartest people believed in God. And a roommate of mine introduced me to, this is kind of it's like the dullest conversion story you've ever heard, but he introduced me to the modal ontological argument as formulated by the Calvinist philosopher Alvin Plantinga, drawing on several versions of the ontological argument, Leibniz and Gödel, but it goes all the way back to the Catholic St. Anselm of Canterbury.
Yes.
And it's an argument that I found very persuasive, but St. Thomas Aquinas did not find persuasive.
That's right.
And
He
so,
didn't have modal logic. That
that's
was
right.
the problem,
Yeah,
right?
that must be it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Plantinga, this sort of Calvinist philosopher teaching at Notre Dame, played a key role. And then I'm guessing, at least in my case, it was C.S. Lewis.
Lewis, of course.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm so predictable. I was walking around campus, an evangelical Protestant guy was giving out books. I was always kind of interested in religion, but I'm always interested in free stuff. So he gave me, he had Mere Christianity. I picked that one up. I read it, over a cigar when I got back home. And I said, well, this is pretty persuasive. And then Lewis led to Chesterton, Belloc, Owen Barfield. And I said, well, I'm pretty convinced. So God exists. Jesus is who he says he is. Later, I came to believe the church is what she says she is. And I was stubborn about it. So from 18 to 23, it was kind of cooking in my head. And then 23 was really the kind of numinous experience and the final reversion.
Wow, that's and it might be boring to have to say that. Maybe you wanted to say I was reading Kafka or Dostoevsky maybe or something, right? But I mean, truth of the matter is, the kingdom of God will be filled with people brought by C.S. Lewis, and probably at least a few by Alvin Plantinga that are interested in that sort of thing. So, well, it's wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about actually some of the stuff that you said in your speech. But I watched you and sort of followed you talk about these things, which is why I was excited about us being able to talk. But you in your speech, and I've seen it on your show, you've talked about St. Thomas Aquinas' idea in the Summa Theologiae of the sort of ideal mixed regime, and suggested that, the American regime created by our constitutional order by virtually all Protestants, or not even Protestants, maybe deists or at best theists, that it sort of matches that. Flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, so in the 250th anniversary, it's kind of funny that we're talking about Catholicism, because the men who founded the country are rolling over in their graves at the very thought of that, including despite my swarthy appearance, on my father's side, I am a WASP, and they would have disowned me for it. But that doesn't really matter. The fact is that the government that they established is very closely, if not identical, it's very closely in accord with the ideal regime laid out by St. Thomas in the Summa Theologiae, and also in De Regno, in which he outlines the times in which a people can overthrow a tyrant. In certain circumstances, it's permissible. And he says the best regime is a regime that has a kingly aspect, a monarchical aspect, an aristocratic aspect, and a democratic aspect. In liberal modernity, we pretend that only democracy is legitimate. Kim Jong-un was just reelected with 99.93% of the vote 2 days ago. So we really believe, even the North Koreans have to be Democrats now. But that isn't the real idea. And so obviously the real idea goes back to antiquity. Polybius explains it well, which is that good government is government that is for the common good. And bad government is government that is only for private interest. So you can have a good monarchy, a good aristocracy, a good democracy, and the bad versions are tyranny or oligarchy or mob rule. So what the framers established for us is what St. Thomas outlines, which is, despite Americans' Republican pretensions, the president is the most powerful king on earth and has been for a very long time. I think Professor Vermeulen observed that the American president is the last monarch of the Ancien regime. And then we have in the past had a more aristocratic element before the direct election of senators. We still do, though, to some degree, the Senate and the judiciary. And then obviously the House is like herding cats, so that's the democracy part. So, you see that reflected. And I don't really care how it got there as long as it did get there. But we can trace those intellectual histories as well. It's not that Madison and Jefferson and all of our founders and framers were reading Thomas Aquinas, but they were reading him 2 degrees removed.
Yes.
They were reading the men who read him at the very least.
That's right. I mean, even if you read, say, Calvin and Luther, read Calvin's Institutes, right, at the sort of beginning of the Reformation. There are certain things contested, the nature of the church, the sacraments, justification. Doctrine of God wasn't contested, and you read the Reformed scholastics and the Lutheran scholastics right after the founders. Those books, their sort of scholastic treatises, read exactly like St. Thomas in the Doctrine of God. And so that stuff gets transmitted. So it's tempting for partisans on either side, I think, to sort of insist that there's this unbridgeable gulf. Another place where we see that, or at least I think, I would argue, but I want to know what you think, is this reference to the laws of nature and nature's God, right? And of course, at the beginning of the Declaration as well, with a reference to the Creator in this public document. So there's at least, seems to be a sort of glimmer of what we, Catholics at least, or traditionalists would call the natural law tradition, though sort of refracted in some ways. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, for those of us who were just at the Catholic prayer breakfast, the talks, at least my talk and Professor Berzer's talk, did focus on some of these intellectual lineages, and we can trace it. We don't really have to guess, which is that, you get St. Thomas, and then you get a number of Thomists, Jesuits really, Francisco Suarez or Robert Bellarmine, who come down the line to Protestants like Algernon Sidney, and I go after the Jesuits almost every day, but the guys get results, they really can transmit ideas. And so we do know that was influencing the thought of Thomas Jefferson, we see this, from Hooker to Locke to Jefferson. So there are a lot of ways in which these ideas have entered in to the American tradition, even if the men themselves might not have recognized it. And maybe they would have, but something that our founders and framers and even the earlier settlers constantly talk about is providence. This reliance on providence. It's the final line of the Declaration of Independence. You see it from the Bradford on Plymouth Plantation. And there is something delightful in providence that this country founded by a bunch of ardent Calvinists would end up so beautifully resembling the regime of the common doctor of the Catholic Church.
I mean, it's absolutely, it's absolutely amazing. Do you think it's possible, because anyone that sort of knows recent American history knows that, let's assume, for argument's sake, that there was this kind of natural rights, natural law tradition that was sort of embedded in the founding and in the American mind. Progressivism, I think, this is sort of a common trope, but essentially sort of swept that away as our public philosophy wanted to replace it with something else, so that even our legal reasoning, originalism, it encourages fidelity to the text. It doesn't encourage a sort of appeal to natural law categories. I'm wondering if you have any sense if there would be a way, or maybe it's already happening, to recover something of this natural law tradition in which something like universal moral laws and the existence of a creator are treated as public rather than sectarian truths.
Certainly. Look, there's a desire for that is quite pronounced. I think you especially see that among some millennials and Zoomers. They recognize that the craziness reached its apotheosis during transgenderism. That's why conservatives talked about it for years on end. And the left talked about it for years on end.
Absolutely.
That was the extreme of voluntarist politics, I guess.
Yeah.
The insistence that our tyrannical wills will reshape reality, and people realized that idea was wanting. So I think there's clearly a desire to return to something like objective reality, metaphysical realism, the natural law. You see this reflected in the conversions of Zoomers in particular, especially the brainy Zoomers, especially the ambitious Zoomers. It doesn't have to be a population-wide phenomenon to create massive cultural downstream effects that we'll be seeing for decades. That's all there. There is a real desire for it. Now, how that is effected, I think, depends upon how we interpret the American founding. And so interpretation here is really key. There are some people who insist that the founding is just irretrievably Protestant and liberal, and we just have to toss the whole thing out. And it's not
among our fellow Catholic conservatives, to be clear.
It's not just Protestants and liberals saying that. Frankly, it's maybe more the Catholics who are saying that. And I think, well, look, I'm not persuaded by that fact. Even if I were, I'm not sure I would say it out loud. But we don't have to be. And this, look, we're in the room at the Heritage Foundation, so we can get a little weird and esoteric, I guess. I was thinking about this from the perspective of semiotics, which is how are we even to interpret anything, but how are we to interpret the American founding? And I'm brought to the work of the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the fathers of semiotics, who is reading Jean Poinsot, John of St. Thomas, who himself is faithfully reading Thomas Aquinas, providentially or coincidentally. And Peirce's idea, drawing on Jean Poinsot, is that we interpret signs in a triadic relationship. So there is the sign vehicle, like the red light. There's the object of the sign, whatever the red light is pointing to. And that's where a lot of the liberal semiotics, left-wing semiotics, ends, a dyadic relationship. No, what Peirce and Poinsot are pointing out is that there's actually a triadic relationship. There's this third part, which is the action of the mind, of the interpretant. And so in the case of the red light means stop, so it means we have to stop, right? Well, not really, not when I'm driving. Let's use the yellow light, that's a better example. Some people would see the yellow light, they'd slow down, not me. I see the yellow light, I say I must speed up. There's something, the meaning is different for me and for a granny who's driving her Lexus down the road. And so in this way, when we interpret the American founding, we can totally grant that these men were not endeavoring to establish a Catholic republic or anything like that. But we can recognize that what they have done has created a meaning that is very much in line with the natural law tradition, with the Thomistic tradition, scholastic tradition, and so we're not stretching the meaning of our nation beyond the bounds of reason. What we're really doing is transcending a debate between metaphysical realism and metaphysical idealism. We're not just concocting this in our minds as Descartes would destroy modernity, but we're saying, no, there is something real here, but there is an action of interpretation. I can really pull the meaning out of the American founding, and we can end up with a republic that, of course, no one could have precisely envisioned. That doesn't mean it isn't real. And the fruit of that is around us. Catholics are 20% of the population. We're 28% of the Congress, 38% of the governors. We've had a Catholic in the White House, if you count the Vice President, First Lady, for the last 17 years straight. By golly, we have an American as Pope, okay? I don't think we need to prove our point anymore.
That's beautiful, and we were told downstairs not to get too esoteric, so I'm not going to tie in Thomas Reid and Michael Polanyi to your point about Peirce, but we'll sort of skip that for later. Let's go back to sort of the pre-founding, because of course one error is to sort of isolate the American experiment, is often called, either in one single idea or one document like the Declaration. But of course, these were colonies. These were English colonies. Many of them formed around religious covenants. The Pilgrims fleeing the popish Henry VIII, right, or slightly too popish Henry VIII. They weren't classical liberals, No. That's not what they set up. I mean, they were sort of essentially religious authoritarians. So it's not like I had a friend, I was listening to a podcast he was being interviewed on yesterday, very smart guy, not at all religious, that literally said the Pilgrims left and came to the New World to establish religious toleration, which of course is not the case.
Ask Anne Hutchinson about that one.
No, exactly.
After the Indians mauled her in New York.
And so it's obviously a complicated mixed bag of these different colonies. But even at the time of the founding, right? Even the ratification had happened. A number of the colonies still had established religions, had blasphemy laws. And so it was nothing like the constitutional order as the people who set it up understood it, was nothing like a sort of public square scrubbed of all vestiges of religion. Now, I'm not arguing that we go back to, having the individual states, sort of have establishments, because I have family in Texas and they'd be forced to be Baptists, for instance, right? But I mean, is there some way to recover that basic that basic idea, okay, no national establishment, but genuine free public exercise of religion in the public square.
I think so. I mean, Reagan had the very famous line that it's not that our opponents are ignorant, they just know so many things that aren't so. And to hear them discuss the colonial era and into the founding era, they're describing a country that never was. It doesn't resemble it at all. When you look to some of the colonial constitutions, I mean, they're quoting Deuteronomy and calling for death to blasphemers, When I think of one of our earliest ancestors, Governor Bradford, he forced everyone in Plymouth to work on Christmas Day. The separatists, who were not that religious and who were more Anglican, said, hey, can we just stay home and hang out? It's Christmas, He said, all right, that's fine. He comes back from the fields. He sees that some people are playing with toys. He takes all the toys away from them. He says, if you don't sit quietly in prayer, I'm going to make you go to the fields. So this is rather authoritarian. So much even of the criticism of the founding is irretrievably liberal and individualist. A lot of that comes much, much later. To your point, when the First Amendment is ratified, we had established churches in the colonies, many of the colonies. They persisted for quite a while after the ratification. And really, you only get the hyper-individualist read after the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
So this comes much, much later. Don't blame John Adams for that.
Right.
Don't blame Madison. So I think the liberals push things a little bit too far, because the liberals will try to convince the amiable conservatives, well, you don't want to live in a state that's going to force you to be a Baptist.
Right.
You don't want to go back to these. Say, okay, sure. However, we do have established religion in the country. We have pride parades, we have banners, we have all sorts of rites and rituals that we are largely obliged to participate in. And as in any confessional state, you can get a pass sometimes, but you are ostracized for it. You are marginalized and stigmatized. So that already exists. There is a public religion. The law is a teacher. It's simply a case. Some people like the magical thinking that incentives don't really work as incentives, that if you outlaw something, you'll actually get more of it, or if you subsidize something, you'll get less of it. That's really not how it works. So I think we do have to recognize we have liturgies, we have feast days, we have a pantheon of saints and demigods in liberalism. That is a problem that's not conducive to flourishing. It's making us all miserable. And so we have to replace it with something, or severely reform it. And it would seem to me that if we've got to pick some animating spirit to replace it with, Christianity is probably the one to pick. It's animated our civilization for 1,700 years or so, and it animated our country until much, much later than people think. Not just the middle of the 19th century, but substantially the middle to the latter half of the 20th century.
Well, it was in the middle of the 20th century before this very anodyne public school prayer was, booted out by the court. And see, there's a space here that you're articulating. I'm going to just make it really clear for everyone that's watching online that's about to misrepresent us. Okay, so is that you can have a public culture that has a religious flavor without having a theocracy like they have in Iran, right? And so, because my sense, some of my more secular friends, they think, oh, okay, if you have any kind of religious expression, right, that is, from one of the biblical religions, that's sort of a creeping theocracy. I think it's actually the opposite. It's this implicit secularist, progressivist ideology that's become the sort of de facto public religion that is making many evangelicals, many Catholics sort of overcompensate and try to overcorrect. It's like, okay, well, if this is what we'll have, then I'd much prefer an established religion, and of course I'd prefer it for myself.
Yes, I mean, we even have to establish the meaning of the word theocracy. People bandy this idea about as if a legislator having a moral view is somehow beyond the pale. Theocracy is government by clerics. We have debated theocracy in the West for many, many centuries. Famously, Dante got into a scrum with Pope Boniface VIII over this, but Dante describes the ways in which the secular authority has to be distinct from the spiritual authority, that it can be and must be really illuminated by the spiritual authority, but they are separate spheres. So no one is suggesting that we want to institute some kind of totalitarian government. The irony, to your point, Jay, is that when we talk about leftism today, a lot of conservatives describe it as authoritarian. It's not. It's worse, actually. It's totalitarian. Authoritarian government is when the government says, here are a few things that you got to do or you can't do, and everything else is left up to you. Totalitarian government says you need to rat on your parents for being transphobes, and maybe we'll remove you from their house if they have the wrong political views. That is happening in the United States.
Absolutely. It's sort of the totalitarian state. It requires you to internalize the cattle prod,
yes,
right? In
yes.
which you sort of self-censor because you know there's precisely the things you can't say or do in public. Well, I want to end, and then we'll take questions from the audience with the Daily Wire itself. I mean, I think both of us feel we're at this moment. I'll just speak for myself, in which this is literally what I think is that the forces of darkness would very much like Catholics fighting against Catholics, Catholics fighting against evangelicals, Catholics and evangelicals fighting against Jews, right? They would love that because an amazing thing has happened in the last few decades in which serious religious people of different traditions have learned to work together for the common good. It's clear to me, I don't think one guy is driving this, but it's clear that there's a movement afoot to try to sort of fragment us. And the Daily Wire, it seems to me, is a perfect example of how this can work well. I mean, none of you, you, very, very serious Catholic, you've got pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd, who I think is Byzantine, right? But I think everybody knows he's Catholic, right? Ben Shapiro, of course, is an Orthodox Jew.
He's a Jew?
Yeah, I've heard this. That's what I read on a website.
Yeah.
But I mean, Andrew Klavan is Anglo-Catholic or something like that. Lots of evangelicals. And it's not like you all say, okay, well, when we're speaking publicly, we have to speak as this sort of, as if God and our faith don't exist. You all sort of own that, but you own it together, and the sum, the total is much greater than the mere sum of its parts. I mean, any lessons from how you Daily Wire has been able to make this work for those of us that are trying to work together in the public square?
Yeah, that has always been a feature of Daily Wire, and I love it because when the company started, we would spend the first hour of each day, very unproductive, just yelling at each other in a room usually over politics, but it obviously derives from some of our disagreements over first principles or what have you. But it's been a delightful experience, and I think the Daily Wire has been effective. So I hope that it can, in some way, provide a model for this, because so many of these debates. I mean, look, forget about Jews and Christians, Catholics and Protestants. You get 100 Catholics in a room, especially 100 kind of politically minded, nerdy Catholics. They will find the one thing they all disagree on. They will all presume to excommunicate one another in the moment, and it's rather silly because we've loved for years. We really, in private, we always love talking about religion, probably more than politics, and we're all trying to convert each other to some degree, but. The way that I realized that wasn't going to work, so now we just keep hiring more Catholics. I said, if you can't convince them, you just have to overwhelm them. But we love
open borders at the Daily Wire.
It is, yeah. But what we recognize, I think, is a kind of practical, prudential aspect. One, we've been pals for a long time, and we have a common project, and we want to make America better, and we want to improve the state of the country in the real political community in which we live. And so I love all sorts of debates over whether a monarchy is preferable to democracy, or whether we should read Bonald or Donoso Cortez or Suarez or whatever. I enjoy that a lot. However, in our current communities, the government is trying to take our children because we don't believe boys can be girls. In our real communities, they're trying to obliterate our borders, they're trying to destroy our economies, and they're trying to redefine and abolish the family. So we have bigger fish to fry than which essay of Donoso Cortez is your favorite. And I could tell you which my favorite is. But I think that seriousness of purpose is very helpful here because we have a lot of common goals. Progressivism, leftism, liberalism has advanced so enormously that we're really on our heels, and the hour seems very late. And so for the people who think of politics as mere debate club, I find it charming. I don't have time. We have to be practical here. Aristotle tells us prudence is the chief political virtue, and it's a practical art as well. So we really have to do these things together. This is even in part why the Daily Wire has sought to spin off new businesses, make new cultural products, do the commentary, sometimes help out politicians. We try to do it because we really want practical effects. And we can finally bring Andrew Klavan over from the high church Anglicanism across the Tiber. I hope we do it tomorrow, but we do have a shared purpose today.
Beautiful, and I'd love to play a role in that, actually.
Yeah.
So we have a few minutes for questions. We have online questions, so you can submit those. Maybe we'll start with one of those and then take some questions in the room. Does someone have a mic?
Question from our virtual audience. They asked, do you believe the U.S. Constitution was structurally insufficient because it failed to explicitly codify positive law grounded in the natural law? Specifically, would our current moral crises such as abortion and gender ideology have been averted if the judiciary were constitutionally mandated to strike down any statute that contradicts the natural law?
That's a yes/no question, clearly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Wouldn't that be delightful? Would that it were so simple? But no, first of all, abortion was not a public matter until the 1960s. I mean, it was where it was taken up by the government in the early part of the 20th century, it was outlawed. But it was, when you go back and look at the pro-life record of presidents, you don't get very far because it never really occurred to Eisenhower. It didn't really occur to Kennedy. It just wasn't really an issue. And then the other problem is that if you're counting on the juror, after seeing what the 700 district judges have been doing to our polity over the last year, if you think that some judge would turn away from his or her political priorities because there were just one more line in the Constitution enshrining some aspect of the natural law into positive law, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. That would not work. The issues that came about over the history of the Constitution have more to do, I think, with derangements of the Constitution. The incorporation to the states after the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment itself, creates all sorts of moral hazards, and so those are the issues. But no, I really don't. I don't hammer the framers too much. I think they did a pretty good job.
Yeah. Well, and just to take a contemporary example, Title IX prohibiting sex discrimination, they didn't even define sex or male or female, right? So that's what we're dealing with now. I doubt it would have occurred to Madison to define properly what a male and female are.
Of course.
Yeah,
and
later.
Furthermore, I mean, just to really even to go further on the depth of the problem, the fact that you could have an ostensibly conservative jurist in the 21st century reading the civil rights laws and reading reading sex to mean the opposite of sex, reading protections
identity
on the basis of sex to mean gender identity, which totally undermine the protections on sex, and that's a conservative jurist.
Right.
It wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked.
Alas. All right. In the room, this back here.
Okay. I want to stand up. Mr. Knowles, thank you so much. Considering this great moment of 250 years of our great country, you made me really think about, I don't know if you heard about the theory of George Washington converting to Catholicism on his deathbed.
I love it. I don't believe it for a second, but I love hearing about it. Please tell me.
So would you be able to, if there's a bunch of other theories that go along with that, with his vision of, I guess, he had free visions. He was, I believe, riding a horse in the mountain, and he had this vision of free times of the country that would go for highs and lows. And I wanted to know if you could expand on that, if there's anything else that, the U.S. is actually much more Catholic historically than we think through those two examples.
I do know that John Wayne converted to the Catholic Church on his deathbed. I don't know about Washington. I'm a little bit skeptical. That would be great. And look, if the Protestants can talk about the cherry tree, we can say that he had a mystical vision of some Jesuit saint. However, I kind of pull away from some of that idea, because I think one of the issues that has faced America that other nations have not really had to deal with of late is that we create myths around our founding fathers, as all polities would do, but ours are really recent. So, we do have their letters. We don't have letters from Romulus and Remus or the She-Wolf, but we do have, even we don't know a ton about Saint Stephen in Hungary, but we do know a lot about these guys. They were quite loquacious. And so there is this conflicting temptation both to deify them and also to denigrate them. You know, you talk to them, they're pulling statues down left and right of the Founding Fathers. And I would prefer to take a more balanced approach to these guys, which is, yeah, they're real men. And it's so recent that we can't help but see that they're real men and they had real thoughts and they got some things wrong, but they got a lot of things right. However, I think the way to preserve something of a civic religion and the mythology that naturally encompasses the founding of a country is to recognize that Providence played a major role, and they understood that they were playing a role within Providence, and that, of course, goes around the founding era, but it goes all the way back to the early 17th century, too. And so I don't think they were transported up to the seventh heaven necessarily, and I don't think that they were dirty, rotten scoundrels. I think that they had one foot firmly planted on the ground in the political order of their day, and maybe they had at least a toe in another ethereal realm. They recognized that there was a destiny for the country and that it would be good because it was governed by a good God.
I mean, there's something wholesome. Catholics do this. I know evangelicals often do this. We will, in part because of our admiration for the founders, who were just objectively extraordinary people, we want them to be more like us. And so it's like, okay, Jefferson, it'd really be great if he was an evangelical Christian. If you're an evangelical, right? It's kind of hard to make the argument. And so I think there's sort of Catholic versions of this as well, which usually involve these unrecorded sort of events. But I think the sort of better part of wisdom is to accept these men, warts and all, and their nobility and what they accomplished. It's fine that Jefferson was, okay, maybe theistic rationalist. He wasn't as deistic as Thomas Paine, but he doesn't have to be all those things to have helped to build this thing.
And I, for one, I'm such a glass half full guy. I find that really delightful because it means that our country, we don't owe our country entirely to the genius of these men and to the indefatigable dedication of these men. Ultimately, we owe the country to God, and these men played a great role, and they cooperated with God's grace, and sometimes they didn't even realize they were cooperating with God's grace, you know, but I find that to be not only more plausible, but and manifestly true just looking around us, but I find it to be more delightful as well. Yeah. I would rather, George Washington is a great man, and I have almost nothing but wonderful things to say about him, but I would rather trust my nation's future to God than even to a man like George Washington.
That's well put. All right, I have time for one more question. Yes, in the back.
Hi, how are you, Michael? I'm with Catholic Vote, and we're excited to have you for our Zeal for America 250 rally. Our goal is to get Catholics educated and to get them out to vote. What can each of us in the room do locally with our families, help our priests get involved, help them understand it's our right to vote. It's part of our American culture. How can we, at a grassroots level, encourage more people to vote?
Without violating Heritage Foundation's 501c3 status, of course. Yeah.
You can say anything you want here.
You could, yeah. The Catholic view of the world is eminently, well, it's sacramental. It's a sacramental view. So it's a realistic view. It's grounded in metaphysical realism, and it's a view that recognizes that our bodies matter, time matters, history matters, what we do every single day matters, the mundane little work that we do really matters. Catholics are not really given over, as some other versions of religion are, to political quietism. You know, occasionally it happens, but not really. We're in the world a lot of the time, too. We have our monasteries, but then we also have our work in the world. And so the church seems very grounded. You know, it's very tangible. You can touch it. We're called to receive sacraments, the sacraments which are the meeting of the physical and the metaphysical. And so part of being in the world is recognizing that man is a political animal. Politics is not a yucky, dirty thing. Aristotle tells us that we're a political animal, and St. Thomas Aquinas calls him the philosopher, so it's good enough for me. We're not mere individuals. We're not mere spirits flitting about the ether. We're not Albigensians. We did this terrible world. We're not Marcionites. We don't think that this world is just evil and something to be fled from. It's a broken world, it's a flawed world, but it has been redeemed, and we will see that redemption play out over the course of history, and we have a role to cooperate with God's grace. You know, God's grace comes down the mountain, but we have free will and we have reason, and we have to cooperate with that. And that's true when it comes to making your bed in the morning. That's true when it comes to being nice to your spouse. And it's true when, you see this really in the context of the family. And it is therefore true in the context of our political communities, because patriotism is an extension of filial piety.
Beautiful. Please join me in thanking Michael Knowles, great American.
A lot of fun. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Well, so now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Brenda Hafera. Got the pronunciation right. She is the Assistant Director and Research Fellow of the B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies. And because she probably won't mention this, I will. She has played the crucial role in our new guide to historical sites, which you can see at the Heritage Foundation website. But with that, Brenda, it's yours.
Thank you. I'm very excited for today's panel. It's going to be terrific. First, we have Elizabeth Spaulding, who is the Senior Fellow at Pepperdine University and Chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is a terrific museum. And as Jay mentioned, I am the museum lady, so that stamp of approval means something. They have a new exhibit just out a couple weeks ago on America 250, so please go and take a look at that. Next will be Matt Meehan, who is the Associate Dean and Associate Professor of Government at the Van Andel Graduate School of Government, just across the street at Hillsdale University. He has an upcoming children's book called The American Book of Fables. It will be epic, I think literally and figuratively. That will come out in May, so please take a look for that. And then finally, we have Carson Holloway, who is a professor of political science and department chair at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. And he has an upcoming book called No Liberty to Libel. So we have some Catholics and some patriots on this panel, all of them. So please join me in welcoming them. Okay, Matt, we're going to start with you. The Declaration of Independence appeals to the laws of nature and of nature's God. What are your thoughts on how the natural law tradition running through St. Thomas Aquinas and the Spanish scholastics shaped, perhaps in a meandering way, the thinking of the American founders? Does it provide a deeper, richer foundation for those words than the secular Enlightenment narrative usually allows for?
Yes, I think there's a couple different ways to think about that sort of tradition, that handing on, the traditio of the nature and nature's God. But I think the rule of right reason, that understanding of nature, that's right out of Aristotle, the natural law tradition, Aristotle mentions it, but it really becomes full-flowered in the Roman Republic. Cicero's the great expounder, and then you get the inheritors of that, like Augustine, Aquinas, and then you get Francisco Suarez, and you get Bellarmine, as Michael Knowles mentioned today at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, or excuse me, Brad Berzer mentioned at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. Then you get Algernon Sidney, and you get Richard Hooker, and then you get our own founding father, James Wilson, and you get a host of these sort of natural lawyers who think this through. And then you also get a development of natural rights along the way, which is, in a certain sense, an additional development of thinking about nature, particularly human nature, nature's God, rooted in this deeply Western philosophical and correspondingly theological account of a teleological man, that human beings are made in a particular way, and because they're made in a particular way, how you activate that, how they maximize their potential, right, means that they're going to actually follow a kind of recognizable, according to reason, set of rules about what will make them flourish, what will make them pursue happiness most effectively to achieve that end. That is one way that, and there's a meandering way to handle that, and we've sort of discussed it here briefly, and then Knowles mentioned it earlier. But I think there's also one that's even more direct, which is kind of hiding in plain sight that we leave off, which is if you step back and say, what is the move to say we're going to talk about nature and nature's God? Well, that's a move to secularity. Well, what kind of secularity? Is it the atheistic secular humanism that's basically deist to theist to agnostic to skeptic to atheist to now I'm actually attacking nature and nature's God and the apotheosis we discussed about the trans movement? Or is it the kind of secularity that actually is the sort that Christians, particularly the Catholics, developed in the early part of the Roman Empire, during the early part of Christendom, through the Roman Empire and the medieval tradition? That is to say, secularity, the seculum, the idea that there's something other than the theological account of things, because there has to be, because the city can't be the church, right? And the pagan city can't have its gods anymore. That's just not going to work. No one's going to light a candle to Rainbow Zeus, right? We've got to get out of that. So what is the actual way we move forward? Well, we say, no, there's actually a forum, literally and figuratively, that is secular, that is according to nature, where even if you don't share my faith, you know that there are things according to reason that we can agree upon, right? And that comes out of the very earliest sort of management of politics for Christians, for Catholics. That understanding then means we want, and this is, I can think, a praxis of Catholics that was inherited by all the Protestant faiths and not rejected, which is we actually like to hold on to natural philosophical teachings as a kind of sidecar for our political theology, lowercase t theology. So Cicero, the most read and copied throughout all the medieval scriptoriums, the most taught. Thomas Aquinas doesn't flesh out all of his natural law teaching because he just assumes you've all memorized, which you had to before you could teach at the University of Paris. He just assumed you've memorized all these things, right? So we brought forward Cicero, we brought forward Aristotle, right? We brought forward these secular philosophical teachings about nature precisely because we understood this is actually the way Christians deal with the fallen city when not everyone shares your priors, even if they're all parroting it, even if you have 90, North Korea level Catholic participation, which you never had, but if you had 99.7% Catholics, there's a lot of people there who don't believe, right? And so you're going to have to make a natural argument too. And I think that is a praxis of our founding that is beautiful and is an inheritor from the Roman imperial Christian tradition and the medieval Christian tradition. And so I think nature and nature's God, the idea that it's some kind of desiccated Hobbesian or worst version of Lockean evacuation of any real content of virtue and the divine is a huge mistake.
Elizabeth Carson, do you want to add anything to that?
You want to go first?
Sure, I had some thoughts on that too. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and thanks for including me. I agree with everything Matt said. I just wanted to add, too, that I think we don't just have to reconstruct this, but the founders admit it. There's that famous letter in which Jefferson says, if you want to understand the Declaration, look at the elementary books of public right, and he mentions moderns like Locke and Sidney, and ancients like Aristotle and Cicero. So he understands himself as operating in that tradition. You did ask, does the natural law, the older natural law tradition, provide a kind of deeper and richer account? I think it does, at least if you're taking maybe what Matt called like the worst interpretation of Locke. I mean, there's significant overlap between Locke and Aquinas in that they both say that self-preservation pertains to the natural law. They both treat the family as if it's something that's required by human nature and natural law. I think in Aquinas you find more attention under the heading of natural law to all the things that perfect us and all the things that beautify us than you would find in Locke. So I wouldn't want to rely only on Locke, But at the same time, I don't think that's kind of an imposition on America from extrinsic sources, because if you thoroughly read the founders and study their lives, they largely recognize the same virtues as necessary to a good human life as Locke did. And the reason that those things are not all laid out in the Declaration is because the Declaration is not intended to be a comprehensive account of every virtue you need for a good society. So I think it's perfectly consistent for us to use and to be formed by that older tradition and to see the way in which it formed America as Catholics.
And I was thinking a bit on how I would view this if I could get in a time machine and go back and be a Catholic in that founding era, maybe a distant cousin of the Carrolls or something like that. And I was thinking that what we see in the Declaration of Independence is that there's a compatibility between faith and reason. I agree with everything that Matt and Carson just said, but it's the laws of nature and of nature's God, and the conjunction is and. It's not or. And I think that's really important. I do think that sometimes a single small word like that can make a difference. And we know that Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration, but there was a committee. They were all smart people too. They all had input. He was the great writer. And then also, as he said, and we've already heard today, maybe twice now, about how what he said himself that he was capturing was the expression of the American mind with all these different strands that we've been talking about. And then finally, I know it's kind of bridging the natural law and the rights question, which we'll probably get to in more depth. But I think, again, there's this compatibility because Catholics at the time and since look at this at our founding, and they're seeing that our rights are deriving as persons from a divine source. And I just think we need to go ahead and say that, because in today's world, it often gets dropped. And this is something that all Christians could believe in and agree with at the time of the founding. And Catholics, though small in number, knew from their faith as well as from reason, because that, our faith doesn't see an incompatibility between faith and reason.
Another symmetry might be in the Declaration that we're created equal, but that
Correct.
it is a self-evident truth,
Right.
both reason and revelation.
Right, and I was actually thinking on that too, because all men are created equal. That's so very Catholic. I mean, you can't get more Catholic than that.
It's actually, it's a secular truth discovered actually by Aquinas on being, in essence, when Aquinas writes a dissertation, right, it winds up being epochal for all of metaphysics for all time, right? So his college thesis was to understand that being is actually being sustained. And it was a question that people hadn't thought through carefully enough. That the fact that my hand is still here requires an actual active power of sustained being. In him we live and move and have our being. That's actually a rationally understood principle. Not easily or likely to be come by without grace and revelation to give you the confidence to build those natural arguments, but it's out of the scholastic Thomistic tradition that we can say, yeah, no, the Creator is actually a self-evident truth. Once you explain this basic fact, then even someone who doesn't agree with us could be made to see that this has to come from somewhere and hold itself in being. So it's both secular and Christian.
Horrific. Elizabeth. Some Catholic integralists and traditionalists argue that the American founding is inherently incompatible with the Catholic understanding of politics because it is Enlightenment liberalism, whatever that means anymore, that rejects the social kingship of Christ. How would you respond to that charge? Could one argue that the ideals of the American founding, rightly interpreted, actually reflect principles, Catholic principles, and might even be strengthened by them?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think, though, we have to spend a moment on where the misunderstanding comes from. And it can spring from several different sources. So for some who disagree with what we're saying up here, they might think that they just don't understand about the faith and the founding, that there can be a compatibility, the founding with our faith, or both. Sometimes they see it that way. Some people have a frustration or an anger or both about what's going on right now, and they might be projecting backwards. And then some have decided, well, it's all bad, and I'm going to withdraw from the public square. And I call these, sometimes I'll think of these as like the moat and drawbridge Catholics who just don't want anything to do with anything. But all of them end up joining in a critique that's incorrect. I think that building off of what we've been talking about in the first question, right reason right away can help here. The principles of the founding are very personal. They're rooted in the dignity of the human person who is made in the image and likeness of God. And thus that means we are endowed, we possess certain, as the word was, unalienable rights, inherent rights. These are rights that are independent of government. And Brenda mentioned that I'm chairman of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And I have found in teaching about comparative government and ideologies and about communism and its evils, it's based on lies ultimately, that so many people don't understand what we're based on. And I think that's true of some of our friends who go the wrong direction on understanding the founding. So we have these inherent rights independent of government. I mean, that's what the Declaration of Independence was talking about, and that's what the the government that was set up understands that. And then that further means that we have to understand that if these rights are not somehow inherent, then whoever, orphan quotes, scare quotes, whoever gave them to us can take them away. So we know the founders were thinking consistently and constantly about how they didn't want any tyrant to take away these inherent rights. This was part of the reason for, effecting independence, announcing it, and acting on it. But also, and there were things that had swirled around in history. They looked at problems in political history. You could anticipate that there could be other types of tyrants, that you don't want the state to be so big, or what we would now look at, a single-party state, anything like this. And so if you have that kind of thing in charge, it can take away rights. And I just want to say that the founders are so concerned about making sure that there's no tyrannical power that is understood as somehow granting, giving rights. So this is very important. And the Enlightenment liberalism point, I think we were really discussing here how the founders had this rich and multifaceted understanding of politics and history. And so they knew and said over and over again that this was an experiment in self-government, right? They knew that it could fail. They didn't know what was going to happen. And so they were looking for what was right and true, a lot of what we've already been talking about. They were also looking for what was most practicable, as we also have been talking about. But the natural law, as we've been hearing, it goes back. It starts with especially Augustine and Aquinas and others. We have all of Western civilization. If you were at the National Catholic Breakfast, you were hearing about that already. Michael Knowles was talking about that a little bit with Jay Richards. So that's another strand. So we have all these enduring truths and beliefs from the Christian West, from Judeo-Christianity as we talk about it now, from Greco-Roman thought. People forget about, these are just the basics that the founders were drawing on. And then all of that had been systematically contemplated and played out over the course of centuries, and the founders could look at that too. The English constitutional tradition, which my two colleagues on this panel can both talk about at length, and that itself, though, is ultimately rooted in the Christian West. And what's the Christian West ultimately? It's the church, right? That's where it started. And then, yes, also aspects of Enlightenment liberalism, but it's understanding the mix and not saying that it was just that. And I can understand, but I don't understand why certain people get just stuck on that and say it's only that, and that it was only that from the beginning. Because as we've been talking about, it wasn't that either. And that the big thing was, no divine right of kings. They didn't want to set up something that would be that would eventuate that way. And so accepting and using aspects of Enlightenment liberalism makes sense, because that was starting to break from the divine right of kings. I have more to say, but that's probably enough to start with.
Some seem to forget that John Locke wrote his discourses against Sir Robert Filmer, who was making an argument for the patriarchy and for the divine right of kings, which is
Right.
important to remember.
Right.
Thanks. I guess I agree with everything that was said by Elizabeth, and we might be saying that a lot on this panel. I would just want to say to the originalists that, or not the originalists, sorry, the integralists. I would want to say to the integralists that, it is the case that the American regime is incompatible with the Catholic conception of the best regime, which would probably include some public affirmation of the truth of the Catholic faith and its importance to society. But that doesn't make the American regime incompatible with the Catholic conception of politics, which is what you ask about, because that conception understands that human situation is imperfect, we're stained by original sin, and we're not expected to find, or we're not expecting to find perfection in any human institutions or even in divine institutions that are made up of human beings. So I find Aristotle very helpful on this. Aristotle has a conception of the best regime, which he keeps always in view as a standard of perfection. But he also has an account of the best practicable regime, which is worth preserving and worth understanding if you have it. Aristotle says that democracy and oligarchy are bad forms of regime, but he also says that nothing prevents them from being in a satisfactory condition. And the older I get, the more I feel that satisfactory politics is really good. It certainly beats the alternatives that we've seen in the last few centuries. So, Christians had to live under a variety of regimes, a lot of them not that great, and it seems to me that the traditional approach was that if they observe some bare minimum of justice, and if they allow you to preach the faith and to live out the faith, you should give your allegiance to them. We had to live under, our ancestors had to live under the Roman Empire. No less authorities than St. Paul and St. Peter said, reverence the emperor, obey the laws, worship God. So the American regime is not a bad regime. It's a regime for which we can be grateful because it establishes kind of worldly order in which we can pursue a lot of worldly goods, and it also gives us the freedom to proclaim the kingship of Christ. So there's a lot to be valuable, or a lot to be valued there, I would say.
I think I would just only add to the discussion of natural rights that in the same vein of the tradition of thinking about them, natural rights are very old. They're not a creature of the Enlightenment. And I think that's just the fundamental mistake that a kind of tabula rasa, like I mostly read Marx and then I kind of read a couple good books on the side, and I'm a smart kid and now I'm in the world trying to be an American. And they're sort of lost and they don't know that tradition, that rights start getting talked about in Cicero as the natural law prescribes certain civil rights, which is pretty close, right? There's a connection there. He doesn't say natural rights, but it's one and then the other, and they're linked. And if you don't have this, this is garbage, right? So you're already talking about rights for groups, but even rights for certain kinds of individuals inside the Roman Republic from the beginning. Brian Tierney has written about this. Canon law in the 900s starts to go, maybe there's natural rights that people have in court, right? And they were mentioned at by Brad Berzer in his talk at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast about right to face your accuser, innocent until proven guilty. Those kinds of things are actually framed in a kind of light. It's not as big and triumphant as you get in Locke, but natural rights. Aquinas in the Treatise on Law and the Summa mentions it. He's got pluralized rights according to right reason in nature, right? And then you get Suarez and Bellarmine, and of course, yes, you do get Locke and others and the founding fathers themselves. But part of the reason why it's such an important thing is because this same issue, actually, we now know that the government can't tell us about God or our final perfections in the afterlife. Like President Donald Trump or Tip O'Neill or Bill Clinton, the Supreme Court can't tell me how to get to heaven, right? I have a special calling from God to pursue my happiness unto and beyond the veil of death. That's something from God, from Christ, from religion, right? Therefore, I know the government's going to kind of get some things wrong because they like to control things, they like to tell me what to do, and they try to lay down rules for living, which they should. So it behooves us to have the language of individual natural rights such that we can say, hey, hold on, Caesar, you have this thing that you have to respect. Even though you don't fully understand everything I need from securing that right, i.e. all the details of the pursuit of my happiness through faith, but I have now a syntactical way to talk to you about protecting that road. And that comes from it's so much earlier than the Enlightenment, the generation of the thing, which leads to, in a certain sense, when America finally does in the Declaration say, boom, natural right, we're going to do this, life, liberty, pursuit, and happiness. That is a kind of fruition of something that Christians, Catholics, the West has been mulling over and trying to build for a long time.
Right. Madison says it's the government for which humanity has been sighing since the most remote ages.
Yeah.
Carson, Catholic social teaching emphasizes both the dignity of the person and the common good. Critics on the right say the American emphasis on individual rights undermines the common good, while critics on the left says it enables a cruel, unfettered capitalism. Are those fair critiques? What do you make of the argument some have made that the founding documents actually balance these two principles in a way that is consistent with Catholic anthropology?
I mean, I'm persuaded that modern democracy does tend to elevate a certain form of individualism at the expense of the common good. I think that's in Tocqueville's great diagnosis in Democracy in America, and I respect his account a great deal. And I like the solutions that he proposes, like religiosity and local self-government. But I don't really think that that's a problem that can be traced to the moral and political philosophy that was embraced by the founders. The American founders were champions of individual liberty, there's no question, but they were also committed to the idea that there's an important moral distinction between liberty and license. Liberty understood as the freedom to do what you wish within decent moral limits. License understood as just untrammeled liberty to do whatever you feel like. This is in Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. It's reaffirmed over and over again by the great American legal commentators, men like James Kent, James Wilson, Joseph Story. I just think it's deeply rooted in their moral thinking and their political thinking. There's a distinction between liberty and license. And this means liberty is using your liberty in such a way that it's consistent with the rights of other people and with the common good. So, for example, they defend freedom of speech, but they also say that you can be held to account for your abuses of freedom of speech if you damage someone's reputation. And as Michael Knowles was mentioning in his remarks, it was not uncommon among the states at the founding to have laws against blasphemy, either because they thought blasphemy was an attack on the moral foundations of the society, or at least because, as James Wilson said in his lectures on law, it's a form of nuisance, it's a public disturbance, disturbs the public order. So this is not the thinking of people who elevate individualism in an extreme way that's incompatible with the common good. Thinking about the concerns of the left, the unfettered capitalism, I don't think the founders can be accused of that either. I mean, they're Lockeans. They believe in a natural right to property, a right to contract. But Locke teaches that when you enter into civil society, you're consenting to the idea that the law will regulate your use of your property for the sake of the common good. The founders thought that way. It's in the Constitution. Article 1 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce among the states and with foreign nations, which is not a power that we're given by people who believe simply in unfettered capitalism. And I think it's pretty clear, and I did something for Heritage on this some years ago, the founders' understanding of trade, they expect trade and the economy to be regulated in the national interest. And then one last point I'd like to make on this is Article 3 gives the power to the courts to decide cases under law and equity. What is equity? Hamilton takes this on in the Federalist Papers and says, we have an equity jurisprudence because it's understood that some contracts are unconscionable because they take undue advantage of the necessities of another person. I mean, this again is part of a kind of thinking that just doesn't believe in unfettered, absolute liberty to do whatever you want. Founders were champions of liberty. They were not doctrinaire libertarians. So that's how I'd answer that.
I would like to pick up on the private property part. because I think that this is an area where, since the founding, too many people have ceded private property to the communist perspective, as well as to the unfettered capitalism critique perspective. And that's actually coming from very reductionist, materialistic grounds. And it's not understanding what private property is. And the Christian understanding of private property, and the Catholic Church has been very clear on this, is that the right to own property is an extension of the dignity of the human person, of ourselves as individuals, including everything from soul, ideas, and speech, right, to land, home, businesses, enterprises. And God wants us to participate in and contribute to his creation. I mean, this is just something that gets ceded all the time, and we should go ahead and take it back and explain it. So there's nothing inherently evil in money. Now, because we are Catholic, we are not meant to hoard private property. We are here to know, love, and serve God. And if you go back to the great commandments, I mean, we're supposed to love God with all our heart, strength, and mind, and soul, and then we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. That means we cannot forget our neighbor, right? We're not supposed to forget our neighbor. We're going to be interacting with our neighbor. In the old days and now, it's still going to be proximity physically, but in these times, it's also going to be digitally. In some ways, we are in contact with neighbors. I don't know how often you see some great cause and you go ahead and donate online. The founders couldn't do that, but they would say, that's good. That's a good use of your property. But it doesn't mean that we have to give everything away, and we're supposed to give away our attachment to things. And I was thinking on this question, and I knew some of what Carson might cover because of his areas of expertise, and two lines kept coming back to me. One of them from the late great historian Richard Pipes. He would quote a 19th century Russian philosopher who said, whereas Jesus urged his followers to give up their possessions, socialists and communists want to give away the possessions of others. This is a very important distinction to draw. And two, from the late great British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, she said this in 1968. It wasn't the only time she said it, but the earliest I can find it is 1968 in a speech. She said, "Money is not an end in itself. Even the Good Samaritan had to have the money to help." I just think that's a great riposte right there.
Yeah, just two tiny points, the sort of little gilding of the two excellent answers here that I agree with. One, property, the word proper and property, there's actually a Latin pun from Cicero on that the founders were well aware of.
It wouldn't be a Matt Meehan panel if everything didn't go back to Cicero.
Beware of the man of one book, but I have a couple, but
We haven't gotten to St. Thomas More yet.
That's right. Well, and so here we are. The other thing, Thomas More, it's worth noting.
We know each other.
Yeah, he is the first person to secure free speech for anyone in the English-speaking world, and he did it for Parliament. Now, that's not a natural right, but he made a natural argument, and the argument was completely rooted in virtue, that for prudence, for good law, for the happiness of England, we can't be afraid of you, O sovereign. So if we could, we would like to have free speech so that we are not worried about damaging your majestas, your majesty, O majesty, for fear that you will get bad counsel. Which is, by the way, the underpinning argument for free speech in large part, is so that we can talk to one another, share truths, so that we can shape one another and shape our laws together. That's the purpose of it. It has a teleological and natural end, just like property. If the pursuit of happiness is according to our nature such that we're virtuous, then we need to have property, because one of the virtues is, generosity, liberality. So you can't be generous if you don't hold private property, because the willingness to let it go out of love of a friend is something that will make you happy. So all these things for the founders were all just rooted in the natural virtue ethic and the pursuit of happiness, rightly understood.
Yeah.
Right, I will say Madison has a little essay called Property, and he says not only do we have a right to property, but we have a property in our rights. and he includes things like conscience and that. So it very much reflects the Catholic robust understanding. We're a little short on time, so I'm going to do a quick round on this last question for all three of our panelists. How can faithful Catholics today become the kinds of citizens who both love and defend our country and help it live up to its own best principles for the next 250 years?
Whichever. Yeah.
I think some of what is necessary will sound both realistic and fanciful, easy and hard, and it's not really going to surprise you in some ways. I do think education is key. For the next 250 years, at least the first part of that time, there are both encouraging and discouraging signs and trends. I think that classical Catholic and classical Christian education in general is a really good sign. We've even got classical charter schools, so that's excellent. Matt can tell you more about the Hillsdale model. I'm always impressed by these little engine that could schools that you see all over the place, as well as larger schools that are more established. Homeschooling, and then the fact that you've got that going on with private religious, good public schools, and we live in a country where families have the option of doing one or more during the course of the lives for their children. So I think we have to explain to people that the support of religious liberty is very central to that education space, in terms of it being a good in and of itself, and then also for American citizens in the making. But while education is key, I really do think the family is required, and that in turn needs our Lord and his church, the body of Christ. And we have to keep fighting to win the culture. We have to defend and model the social institution that precedes politics, that was instituted by God, and it, as I said, it precedes political forms of rule. And I think people forget that too. And I'm finding more and more when I talk in places where you can speak explicitly of faith with young people, whether they're my students or young professionals or interns, I will listen, I will encourage them on their careers, but more and more I'm actually saying, i.e. telling, you're gonna, if they're Catholic, if you don't have a vocation to the priesthood or the religious life, you need to get married and have children. And I think that's part of this for the next 250 years. And I tell them I will pray for them. But that also means, when looking ahead, that I think we have to commit to what John Paul II called the new evangelization. And we all have a job in that. He used the term for the first time during his 1979 trip to Poland. This is, some people know it as the 9 days that changed the world. I sometimes lovingly refer to it as the Be Not Afraid tour. He was over 50 homilies and speeches, all on message during 9 days, which of course is a novena length. Over a third of the Polish population saw him in person at some point. And so he, as we heard a little bit earlier, I think we heard at least somebody talking about this at the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. The Pope called for the old message, but the new ardor, methods, and expression in this new evangelization of the gospel and the cultures that needed it especially. And Bishop Robert Barron, whom I'm sure many here know of and maybe follow, he's credited John Paul II for sensing some of the changes that would happen in the culture with respect to technology and social media. And I think we need more of that too. So I think asking for the intercession of St. John Paul the Great and now Blessed Fulton Sheen should very much be part of this project for the next 250 years too.
I agree with all of that. The thought, my mind went to John Paul II, Pope St. John Paul II's memory and identity, sort of his send-off. And the idea of knowing who you are comes in a certain sense from having a memory of your origins and where you came from. And Michael Knowles, at the beginning of this event, mentioned this idea of patriotism being actually a virtue, an extension of piety, or it's a species of the genus, right? There's religion, then there's piety to the family and the fathers, and then there is the kind of patriotic piety towards founding fathers and those who have given their civic devotion. For a democratic republic, it's actually kind of nice because it's both, right? Even if you're a second generation, you've already got some fathers who helped vote and build the country, right? And the longer you've been here, you've got lots of people that on your family level that you can be proud of and thankful for, that built the roads, maintained the republic, defended our liberties here and abroad, et cetera. But I do think, what is the line from Shakespeare, looking makes for liking, a kind of inattention to civic matters where we just don't put our minds to it. And I think that's a curricular question with regard to education, but it's also a social question that there is something in late 20th century Catholicism that felt like it was sort of cringy and weird to care about fife and drum, sort of patriotism, American history. And I think that's worn away as so many other things have worn away, and now we're in a tabula rasa moment of natural rekindling of what is good from first principles. And it turns out you actually are, as you said a moment ago, Carson, right? You're supposed to love what you've been given, right? And we've been given something very beautiful, but even if you're not so sanguine as I am about what we've been given, you're actually supposed to love it with optimism, right? Because looking makes for liking, and liking makes for loving. And loving is actually how you build and serve anything. And if you want the common good, if you want America to thrive, if you want a golden age, then you're gonna have to know and love what we are. And that requires a lot of focus and concentration. Maybe read some books.
Maybe go to some historic sites.
Yes, and then the most practical, coda is, dads, stop the car and look at the historical marker. Do it. We've done it. We literally the whole country's been set up for you to annoy your children. Go do it.
I guess a thought that came to mind in listening to my colleagues' remarks, which I agree with, is that there's a certain kind of romanticism that undermines patriotism for progressives. They want to project some future thing that they love. It's a distraction from loving the country they actually have. I think Bruce Springsteen said once, we love the country that we carry in our hearts. It's some kind of imaginary thing that we will get to, and then the country will be worthy of our love. The temptation of conservative romantics like me is to postulate some kind of best regime in the past when things were really great. And we'll love that, but you're really called to love the country you have, And we don't deserve to be Catholics in the sense, we didn't deserve that in the sense it was just given to us. We didn't deserve or earn being Americans. That was just given to us. These are good things that have been given to us that we have a duty to try to transmit. And I would say something else about agreeing with Elizabeth on the idea of education. You can't transmit a civilization unless you teach reverence for it. And I just think that's not being done sufficiently. Too much education is either purely instrumental about preparing the workforce, or if it's more than that, it's this, I don't know why we pay for this, but kind of critiques of our civilization that are demoralizing. So we really have to recapture kind of civilization building education that I don't think we're doing right now.
If I may, just one. And I remember I was born in Washington, D.C., but then my parents eventually moved to the suburbs, and I went to school for the most part. I guess pre-K through, kindergarten through, you don't need to know, on the Maryland side. But at that time, especially at Catholic school, we were taught history, and then also you were taught the Catholic history of Maryland, which we didn't even have time to get into, but it's so beautiful. And here's another place where Matt Meehan can
The Ark and the Dove.
Yep, the Ark and the Dove. It's such a beautiful story. And so I think that's part of the education is going to go on at home as well as in school, whatever the school part looks like. And this is an opportunity with America 250 to teach and then instill that patriotism very naturally and its connection to piety, as Aquinas would say, And so, gosh, if you're not going to grab this moment now, when are you?
We have a couple minutes for questions.
We'll start with a question from the virtual audience. What about the role of deism in the founding of the U.S. government? Were the founding fathers influenced by deism, given that many of them were deists?
I know.
Do you want to
And
take it, or-
we have, yeah, you start.
Make
We only have a couple
quick
minutes. Go
shot.
for it.
One, that if you heard, it was given that many of them were deists. I actually don't think many of them were. I think some were, a few were, but I also think less than they think, because think of Washington. Washington was trying to be very respectful of the fact that people held passionately different views about certain theological commitments. And so when you speak about God, people are watching to see what kind of language you use and whether you're leaning towards this church or leaning towards that church, right? And so everyone's kind of Washington, watch what you say. And Washington is obviously extremely prudent and careful. He knows that he doesn't want to favor anyone and cause dissension. He understands that there's multi-denominational American society. So the way he talks about the supreme being sounds kind of deist. The idea that he definitely therefore was a deist because he uses careful public language that everyone can agree to, knowing full well that everyone's going, yes, and I will pray to Jesus, or I will pray to Jehovah, or I will pray to Adonai, right? Like, they know what they're doing. And so the kind of code switching of a pluralistic society that has a public generic reference to God, that isn't deism. That's peaceful, charitable prudence.
And I would add that I think of deists as not believing in divine providence or a God that cares about humans. Washington clearly believed in providence, that God takes care of nations and individuals. I've never figured out exactly what he's referring to. We talk about 7 crises in the American founding where God clearly intervened to help the country. And he believed that his life had been spared too.
Charity and humility. He says God helps us be charitable and humble. That's not a deist.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, in the middle.
What is to be done about the current progressive perversions of our constitutional liberties? And I'm thinking here about religious liberty in particular. I'm from Indiana, and one of our local judges just became the first judge in the country to find a religious right to abortion. And I'm also thinking about cities like Dearborn, Michigan, that are majority Muslim, that are systematically discriminating against Christians. There's no doubt that the founders believed themselves to be protecting various expressions of Christianity and Judaism and the rights of Americans to pursue the natural law. But what do we do when these liberties are now being asserted as a way to get exemptions from the natural law?
I get whichever.
No, I mean, I don't know what to say other than you just have to keep fighting it, right? I mean, you have to keep teaching the truth about these things and taking it into court. There's a lot of problems, and not only American education, but American law. We've seen that merely correcting a very erroneous and unjustifiable Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, doesn't solve all of our problems because there are activist judges in every state that are willing to invent rights that don't really exist, I think, in the state constitutions either. So, I mean, it just takes a lot of education and a lot of patience. Any good principle can be perverted, and then that kind of tempts you to take the shortcut of just jettisoning that principle. You know, let's not rely on that anymore because too many bad applications will come along. But I don't think we can really do that. We have to try to find a way to recover the correct understanding of all of these constitutional liberties.
I do think Matthew 10:16, behold, I send you out as sheep among wolves. Be therefore wise as serpents, innocent as the dove. Being a seriously engaged and good civic American is part of the ways in which you can actually freely exercise religion and defend it much more ably than if you don't have a habit of civic service and patriotic engagement, and then suddenly you get smacked upside the head by some hideous judge, local or otherwise, and then you kind of like deer in the headlights. Well, what do I do now? And this audience, in a certain sense, is, I'm preaching to the choir if you're here at Heritage in one sense, but in another, it is something we need to think about, because that is actually a great way to be ready to fight and be more ably equipped to fight, is if we use those civic engagement muscles more and see those things as the kind of your daily reps so that you can fight these fights.
And encourage younger people to get involved as early as they can. There's no reason why they have to wait until they're 18 and of voting age. They can be involved in different things, even at the community grassroots level. And then I encourage young professionals to think about, especially if they're here and they're thinking about going back home, I'll say do something in local government. Do something really very much on the ground. Because if more and more people do that, then there's less and less of a chance of these bad court decisions and laws.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you all very
Thank you,
much.
Brenda.
Thank you, Brenda.